listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio. The Blessed Woman. Learning about grace from the women of the Bible.
Chapter 8. Leaving the baggage behind. Overcoming insecurity. Suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. And Miriam was shut out of the camp 7 days, and the people did not journey until Miriam was brought in again. Numbers 12, verses 10 and 15. The day I started school, my first grade teacher declared war on the great state of Texas. It was purely an academic war, of course. No bullets flew, no bombs exploded, but there were casualties just the same. And on the warm September morning, as I curled my fingers around a crayon and began to draw, I became one of them. My teacher, by giving me a blank sheet of manila paper instead of a reading primer, had fired her first shot. To be clear, she wasn't really aiming at me. Her sights were set on a newly passed Texas law that required all children 5 years old to enroll in school, including the youngest of the bunch whose birthdays fell in August. According to my teacher, August babies were still too immature for first grade, and they had no hope of learning to read at such an early age. Therefore, the law should be changed, and she meant to prove it. Thus, while the other children practiced the alphabet and stumbled through the adventures of Dick and Jane, she marched August babies like me to a drawing table so we could color, remain illiterate, and make her point to the school board. I don't think the school board noticed, but my mother did. Halfway through the year, she saw I wasn't learning to read and tried to intervene. She asked the teacher first, then the principal, to provide the help I needed. But the principal happened to be the teacher's husband and an ally in the war on Texas, so their efforts to assist me were half-hearted at best. At the end of the year, I was promoted to second grade without being tested, without being able to read. My parents and teachers failed to identify the problem and attributed my scholastic struggles over the next few years to a learning disability. The doctors prescribed Ritalin. The school prescribed special education classes. Apparently, I just wasn't very smart. At least that's what everybody thought. Everybody except God, that is. Unimpressed by other people's opinions and my own insecurity, he didn't see me as intellectually inferior. He believed I could learn just fine. So when I got saved as a 5th grader during an evangelistic revival at our church, he put a hunger in me to know what was in the Bible. Then he taught me how to read. To this day, I don't know exactly what process he used. I never learned to sound out words phonetically like my children did when they were in school. I never had a tutor to help me catch up on the lessons I missed in first grade. But with the Bible as my textbook, I somehow deciphered the hieroglyphics that had baffled me for years. I became a decent reader and began to do better in school, although I often lost points on my English compositions for using King James spellings. I wish I could say my insecurities vanished with my illiteracy, but it didn't. Even without the help of my first grade teacher, my August baby sense of inferiority lived on. And like every other human being on the planet, I have been wrestling with insecurity in one way or another ever since. The upside is I've made some encouraging progress, and I intend to win this wrestling match if it takes the rest of my life. I'm not going to do it like Miriam did either. Her insecurity earned her a 7-day timeout and a week's worth of leprosy. Although she eventually learned her lesson, by studying her example, I'm learning mine an easier way. Upstaged by Moses. For a woman in Old Testament times, the Bible gives Miriam a lot of print. A major player in one of Scripture's greatest dramas, she had a myriad of reasons to feel secure about her place in the plan of God, But one thing bothered her. She was perpetually upstaged by her little brother. No matter how well she played her part, Moses always wound up in the spotlight. She didn't mind in the beginning when he was just a wriggling, cooing infant. Like most big sisters, Miriam thought Moses was marvelous back then. Born in Egypt at a time when Hebrew boys were being slaughtered, he needed her, and she relished being there for him. She risked her life helping her parents hide him from Pharaoh's baby killers. When he grew too big to conceal, she worked alongside her mother, turning a bulrush basket into a waterproof cradle. The day the family put Moses into the river, into the hands of God, Miriam felt no twinge of sibling rivalry. Quite the opposite. Her eyes glistened with tears as she kissed her tiny brother's silken cheek and said goodbye. Her heart ached as her mother and father set his miniature ark afloat and watched it drift away on the waters of the fearsome Nile. Although they had all asked Jehovah to guide Moses to his divine destiny, Miriam couldn't bear to let Moses out of her sight that day. Running along the shore, she tracked his little boat as it bobbed along the reeds. She thought perhaps she could scare away the snakes that might try to crawl into it, or, by sheer force of her faith, keep it in the shallows and out of the deep currents that could easily overturn it. Even if she couldn't, at the very least, she would see what happened next. She could bring back news to her heartbroken parents. Good or bad, they would want to know. Of all the dangers that threatened baby Moses, the one Miriam didn't anticipate was Pharaoh's daughter. When Her Royal Highness showed up with her servants at the river to bathe, Miriam caught her breath and took cover. Then she prayed. The basket was floating right toward the royal entourage. Only God could save little Moses now. And sure enough, he did. Pharaoh's daughter, spotting the curious craft, sent one of the maids to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Exodus 2, verse 6. Suddenly, it was Miriam's moment to shine. And shine she did. Stepping out from her hiding place, she surprised Pharaoh's daughter with a brilliant idea. "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" she asked in verse 7. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Verses 8 and 9. Miriam knew even as the events unfolded that God had directed her steps and given her wisdom. The Almighty Himself had awarded her a role in saving Moses, and it was a role she thoroughly enjoyed. Over the next few years, as her brother grew from infant to toddler, Miriam cherished the responsibilities and the subtle sense of superiority that comes with being an older sister. She may have complained about little Moses's mischievousness and his messes, but she smiled all the while. Then one day everything changed. Pharaoh's daughter whisked Moses away to the palace where he lived a lifestyle of royal privilege. Miriam stayed home and slogged through her days as a slave. He got an education while she baked bread and made bricks. He dressed in silk while she wore rags. Somewhere along the way, she began to feel inferior, and then insecurity set in. After Moses grew up and ran away to Midian, Miriam may have put those insecurities behind her, but if she did, they resurfaced for good reason. When her little brother returned from his 40-year hiatus on the backside of the desert, he made his entrance, not just as her parents' favorite child or the hotshot royal prince, but also as miracle-working prophet of God leading the Israelites to freedom. Who can compete with that? Miriam certainly couldn't. Or so it seemed to her. Never mind that God's hand was still on her life. Never mind that she was an acknowledged prophetess. Moses, the same kid who pulled her hair and stuck out his tongue at her when they were growing up, had stolen center stage. She was standing in his shadow, and she wasn't sure she mattered anymore. So she did what we all tend to do when insecurity starts to drive us. She went on the attack, drawing her other brother Aaron into the fray. Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? They asked. Had he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. Numbers 12, verses 1 through 2. Here's a word to the wise. Comparing yourself to somebody else never works to your advantage. It either leaves you feeling superior and full of pride, or feeling inferior and full of envy. Either way, it's going to irritate God, especially if the person to whom you're comparing yourself is one of His own. Miriam verified this truth. Her words of criticism and comparison had barely escaped her lips when, suddenly, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, "Come out, you three, to the tabernacle of meeting." So the three came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both went forward. Then he said, "Now hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak to him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak with him face to face, even plainly, and not in dark sayings. And he sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" So the anger of the Lord was aroused against them, and he departed. And when the cloud departed from above the tabernacle, suddenly Miriam became leprous, as white as snow. Then Aaron turned to Miriam. There she was, a leper. So Miriam was shut out of the camp 7 days, and the people did not journey until Miriam was brought in again. Verses 4 through 10 and 15. The ghost of Christmas past. I'm eternally grateful to be a New Covenant believer living in the dispensation of God's mercy and grace. Otherwise, I might have to spend a week or two with leprosy myself, because there have been times in my life when I have been every bit as insecure as Miriam was. According to one author's description, insecurity refers to the profound sense of self-doubt, a deep feeling of uncertainty about our basic worth and our place in the world. Insecurity is associated with chronic self-consciousness, along with the chronic lack of confidence in ourselves and anxiety about our relationships. The insecure man or woman lives in constant fear of rejection and a deep uncertainty about whether his or her own feelings and desires are legitimate. I can add an amen to that definition and provide any number of personal illustrations. I don't have a little brother named Moses to blame for them either, nor can I give all the credit to my first grade teacher. The fact is, I contracted a massive case of insecurity pretty much on my own. I didn't need anybody to upstage me. I downstage myself, if there is such a thing, so painfully and at such a young age that I vowed early in life never to get on stage ever again. The catastrophes began with my 3rd grade Christmas pageant. Standing on the front row of risers in the new dress my mother had made, with my hair in uncharacteristic curls, I humiliated myself right there in front of my parents, my schoolmates, and everybody else. I butchered the one line I'd been given, one simple line about Jesus, and I messed it up so horrifically that no one had a clue what I said. The pageant proceeded despite my blunder, of course. Most likely nobody paid much attention to it, but the incident left an indelible tattoo on my brain, a permanent reminder of what a poor public communicator I am. In high school, I once tried to prove the tattoo wrong. As an officer in a scholastic club, I agreed to memorize yet another line and deliver it at an installation ceremony, but history repeated itself. I got so tangled up in the sentence that it's a wonder they didn't have to bring the jaws of life to cut me out. Afterward, my mother insisted I take speech classes. I assured her I didn't need them because I would never, this side of the millennial reign, set foot on a public platform again. Ignoring my protest, my mother prevailed, and I ended up taking the classes. But they did nothing to allay my insecurity, nor did they significantly improve my ability. When it came to public speaking, I appeared to be permanently impaired. This did not hinder me, however, from marrying one of our generation's greatest communicators. Talk about upstaging yourself. I did it in a major way. Although the Lord clearly put Robert and me together, it sometimes seems like a practical joke. Really, Lord? I wondered. You think I'm the best helpmate for him? Not that I ever wanted to compete with Robert. I was perfectly satisfied to work hard and support him behind the scenes. I'm a great backstage performer. I like to push other people out front. But as Robert's wife and a leader in ministry, I couldn't hide forever. Like the ghost of Christmas past, the specter of public speaking soon came knocking. My reaction? Stark terror. My own deficiencies in themselves were enough to give me nightmares. When I added to them the fear that people would expect me to have the same gifting my husband has, my hair almost stood on end. Imagining how people would compare me to him and be disappointed, I rejected every invitation to speak. God, however, refused to take no for an answer. So did the team at Gateway. They kept asking and asking and asking me to speak. Encouraging and persistent, they waited with patience for me to overcome my insecurity, just like the Lord and the people of Israel waited for Miriam to recover from her leprosy, and they did it with great grace. Over time, I surrendered little by little to God's will, as I accepted His definition of who I am, which is the one sure cure for insecurity. I began to step into the role He's given me to fill. Although I'm still a work in progress, these days I find myself on a platform with a microphone more often than I ever expected. I'm not exactly comfortable with it yet, but I've decided that it's okay with me for people to see who I really am, even if it's not what they want. I've accepted the place of leadership God has chosen for me, and I'm growing more confident day by day that despite my many inadequacies, together, God and I are able. Hiding in the luggage of life. In addition to my aversion to leprosy, one of the reasons I'm determined to drive insecurity out of my life is because I don't want to end up like King Saul. He's a man, so he's not officially one of our mentors, but I've learned a lot from him anyway. More hard-headed than Miriam, Saul didn't learn his lesson in a week and then move on. He allowed his insecurities to fester for decades. Eventually, they became lethal, but not before they produce 4 dangerous byproducts that will poison those who let insecurity call the shots in their lives. The first of those byproducts surfaced the day of Saul's coronation. It was a time when he seemed to have everything going for him. He had been divinely called and anointed by the foremost prophet of the land to be a leader of the nation. His call had been confirmed by 3 supernatural signs. God had given him a new heart to equip him for his position. And if that weren't enough, he was strikingly handsome and a head taller than any other man in the land. What more could anyone need to feel secure? Saul had it all. Yet when the moment came for him to be presented to the people as their king, when they looked for him, he was not to be found. So they inquired further of the Lord, "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord said, "Yes, he has hidden himself among the baggage." 1 Samuel 10, verses 21 and 22. You have to admit, It was a strange way for a national leader to behave. Imagine an inauguration postponed because the president-elect is hiding in the trunk of somebody's car, and you get the picture. It was a clear case of insecurity on steroids, and Saul suffered from it because he didn't believe what God said about him. He believed his feelings of inadequacy instead. Rather than seeing himself through God's eyes as the divinely chosen head of the tribes of Israel, he saw himself as the least among those tribes. See 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 21, and chapter 15, verse 17. We all know what that's like. We've done it. We've looked in the Bible, heard the wonderful things God said about us, and then let our past insecurities drown them out. We've heard the Lord calling us to step out in faith, then listen to the voice of our doubts instead. In other words, we've all spent time hanging out with the baggage. And why not? Baggage can actually be quite companionable. It doesn't expect anything of us. It won't judge us for our mistakes. But then, it won't applaud us for our victories either. Maybe that's why David didn't spend much time with it. The exact opposite of Saul. He had no patience with the luggage of life. Although he had plenty of reasons to feel insecure, young David had such confidence in God that when he visited his big brothers on the battlefield and saw the Israeli and Philistine armies facing each other, he left his luggage with the baggage officer and hurried out to the ranks. 1 Samuel 17, verse 22. Then while insecure Saul shivered in his tent, unable to believe God because of his insecurity, David killed Goliath. The baggage didn't say anything about David's triumph, but everybody else did. They've been talking about it ever since. You and I can either choose to be like Saul or like David. We can hide out in the insecurities of our past, or we can decide to believe what God says about us. Put our confidence in Him and leave the baggage behind us where it really belongs. Insecure leaders make irrational decisions. Not only does insecurity result in our inability to believe God, it also causes us to make impetuous and even irrational decisions. It tricks us into doing stupid stuff. Saul demonstrates this sad reality over and over again. Consider the time Saul declared a fast and forced his army to go without food, right in the middle of a battle with the Philistines. I'm no military expert, but even I can tell that's a dumb idea. Soldiers weakened from hunger who are fighting a well-fed foe are at a definite disadvantage. Yet Saul ignored this obvious fact. He was so insecure in his place with God that, abandoning all wisdom and compassion for his men, he resorted to religious gamesmanship. He tried to earn God's favor and a military victory by impressing him with a legalistic sacrifice. Now the men of Israel were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be any man who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth, because they feared the oath. 1 Samuel 14, verses 24 through 26. You have to wonder what on earth Saul was thinking in this situation. Why was he so stubbornly determined to make his troops maintain the fast? Didn't he realize he already had God's favor upon him? Didn't Saul know God had made him Israel's commander? See 1 Samuel 10, verse 1. And would therefore freely give him the victory he was now trying to attain in his own strength? No, he didn't. That was the whole problem. Saul never truly trusted God's call on his life. He was always trying to become what he already was. He felt unworthy to be king, so he was constantly trying to prove himself. But it was a hopeless quest. None of us qualify for what God has called us to do. He doesn't even ask us to. He simply asks us to acknowledge His grace and pursue a relationship with Him. All He requires is that each of us gives Him our heart, surrenders to His will, and inquires of Him, "Lord, what do you want me to do?" My responsibilities don't compare to Saul's, so I can't identify with the struggles he faced, but I do know what it's like to feel unworthy of God's call. When I think about what He's done through Gateway, I don't understand why He's chosen me to be a leader here. And myself, I'm totally unqualified. Yet, I know I'm in God's hand, and the more secure I become in my relationship with Him, the more secure I am in the position I've been given. Because I accept this plan as God's and not mine, I don't have to worry that somehow I cheated the system and ended up here by accident. I can be confident the Lord Himself has given me this little corner of the world to inhabit, and that He will enable me to make a difference here. He will empower me to bless this place and these people with His love. After all, God's love is the bottom line. As leaders, at home, at work, or at church, the most godly thing we can do is care for people. If we're so insecure we feel we must impress them, or even impress the Lord with our super spirituality, we're going to harm our own cause, erode our authority, and lose the confidence of those we're supposed to be leading, which is exactly what happened to Saul. When his son Jonathan caught it with his father's troops, he hadn't heard about the command to fast. So he reached out the end of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be any man who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" 1 Samuel 14, verses 27 through 30. Actually, Jonathan said out loud what everybody else, except Saul, must have been thinking. He acknowledged the irrationality of his father's decision and admitted it had cost the Israelites an even greater victory. Most likely, Saul's soldiers never fully trusted his leadership again. Why should they? This wasn't a one-time mistake. Saul routinely undermined his own leadership with such disastrous decisions. Even worse than the fasting debacle was the decision he made in a fit of anger when David, whom he was trying to kill at the time, slipped away from him. Threatened by David's military success and popularity, Saul vented his fury on the innocent people he blamed for David's escape and said, "Hear now, you Benjamites. All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is not one of you who is sorry for me, or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me, to lie in wait, as it is this day." Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, "I saw David the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub, and he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." 1 Samuel 22, verses 7 through 10. Did you notice the name of the man who spoke to Saul there? It's Doeg, which in Hebrew is derived from the root word for fear. That's significant, because fear and insecurity are close cousins. Fear speaks to our insecurities like Doeg spoke to the king. It provokes us to make decisions we'll regret, decisions that will hurt not only us but others as well. Because Saul listened to Doeg's accusations, he believed the innocent priest Ahimelech had betrayed him by assisting David. In a paranoid rage, he cast aside all reverence for the Lord and commanded his guards to kill not just Ahimelech, but the other priest as well. When the guards refused, he ordered Doeg to do it. So Doeg turned on them and killed them, 85 priests in all wearing their priestly robes. Verse 18. This is serious business. Old Testament priests were God's representatives. They heard and relayed his voice to the people. Yet Saul recklessly decided to have them murdered. In doing so, he betrayed a spiritual truth that is as relevant to us today as it was to Saul. The combination of fear and insecurity will kill the voice of God in our lives. I've seen it happen. I watched a woman in church leadership self-destruct right before my eyes because of insecurity. Fear got her ear and pushed her to make poor decisions. Frantic to protect her place of authority, she acted impetuously and irrationally. She was a gifted woman, but she ultimately lost not only the respect of everyone around her, but her position of leadership as well. Instability and insane jealousy. As if his inability to believe and his impetuous decisions weren't bad enough, Saul also became famous for the instability of his soul. He routinely swung from the heights of glory to the depths of despair. First the Spirit of the Lord was upon him, then it departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord tormented him. 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. One moment he was trying to murder David, and the next he was prophesying. See 19, verse 23. Insecurity and instability form a vicious cycle. They feed one another. When we're insecure, we try to regain our security by controlling things. Then we realize we can't do it, and we become anxious and upset again. It's like an emotional seesaw. We're up if things are going our way, and we're down when they're not. Such instability doesn't belong in the lives of believers. On the contrary, the Bible says, the root of the righteous will never be moved. Proverbs 12, verse 3. Secure, stable Christians are such a blessing. I love to be around them. I don't have to wonder what kind of mood they'll be in from one moment to the next. They're like Jesus, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13, verse 8. Because they believe God is in control, they don't try to be. They just carry out their responsibilities to the best of their abilities, and if things don't work out as planned, they trust the Lord and roll with whatever comes their way. As grace-filled, life-giving women, that's how we should aim to be. And we can do it if we'll deal with our insecurities. Do you know what else we can do? We can conquer one of the most hazardous byproducts of all, the green-eyed monster of jealousy. That's something Saul never did. He let jealousy latch onto him the day he heard the people celebrating David's triumph over Goliath. This was their song. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Of course Saul was very angry. What is this? He said to himself. They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands? Next they'll be making him their king. So from that time on, King Saul kept a jealous watch on David. 1 Samuel 18, verses 7 through 9. Saul's jealous watch soon mushroomed into a murderous obsession that corrupted his character and consumed his life. He became David's enemy continually. See verse 29. And devoted years to attempting to destroy him. After failing to accomplish his goal, Saul died an insanely jealous man. Although it's an Old Testament story, it's not an Old Testament problem. The New Testament still warns us to be aware of bitter jealousy and selfish ambition. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. James 3, verses 14 and 16. Some things never change, and this is one of them. Insecurity, unchecked, turns into sin. It results in an inability to believe, impetuous and irrational decisions, instability of soul, and even insane jealousy. It leaves leaders like Miriam sitting on the sidelines and makes kings like Saul unfit to reign. So let's kick insecurity to the curb. Let's believe what God says about us and see ourselves as He sees us. Instead of fretting about our deficiencies, let's focus on His sufficiency and have the time of our lives making a difference in our little corner of the world.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.